Guests, ladies and gentlemen, may we have your attention? Please take your seats as conference proceedings are about to commence. Thank you.
The world is changing at an unprecedented pace. Every industry is embracing change, drawing on a new wealth of insights and tools to advance in today's connected society. At Queen's University, we have a bold ambition to lead the way in the challenges we see ahead. Every day, we touch thousands of lives in our pursuit of excellence. Finding the solutions to real-world issues and inspiring research to have real-world impact. We're protecting the cybersecurity of billions of internet users. We're at the forefront of conflict resolution, making a difference to the lives of children, families, and communities across the world. We're working with industry to develop new technologies. We're creating access to safe, nutritious food for a growing population. And we're at the forefront of major medical breakthroughs, making a real impact on people's lives. We give amazing minds a place to do amazing things in a university fit for the 21st century. We are the heartbeat of one of Europe's fastest growing cities, in a country where the hospitality, welcome and warmth of our people is legendary. Queen's impact economically can't be underestimated either. Every year we play our part, making a multi-billion-pound contribution to the UK economy. While our research is estimated to have an annual impact of over £3 billion. And evidence shows that for every £1 invested in Queen's, over £8 is generated for the economy. Together, we are shaping a better world.
Guests, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage your host, Wendy Austin.
Afternoon, everybody. Terrific video that, wasn't it? And boy, was she ever right. The world is changing. I don't know about the rest of you, but over lunch we were talking briefly about energy. And we're going to inject a little extra bit of energy into the proceedings this afternoon with Stephen Gallagher. Stephen is Director of Strategy for Energy Customer Solutions at SSE, transitioning towards a cleaner, more sustainable energy landscape is very much at the top of the to-do list nowadays, isn't it? Not just for companies, but for countries as well. And Stephen is, well, to put it mildly, well placed to showcase the cutting-edge innovations which are propelling that move forwards. Transforming the world via innovation in energy. Please will you welcome Stephen Gallagher.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, transforming the world in 15 minutes. So, I'm going to cut out a few of the galaxies, but hopefully we can cover quite a bit. But it's great to be here to give some insights into the innovations that SSE are looking to drive forward in the energy transition. By means of introduction to SSE, we're a FTSE-listed business with about 15,000 employees and plan to spend 40 billion between now and 2032 on our net zero roadmap. Primarily, we operate in the UK and Ireland and have expanded globally over the last few years. We are active across the full energy value chain, from generation of energy to distribution across energy networks and to supply of energy and related decarbonisation solutions to end users. Here in Ireland, we have about 1,300 employees, 750,000 customers, and we own and operate over 30 wind farms and thermal plant. So decarbonisation and sustainability are at the core of what we are trying to achieve in SSE and what is required across the energy sector and beyond. Operating across that full value chain from generation to plug is exciting, but it's also really challenging, but gives us a deep understanding of the role of energy in our society. Our energy solutions business supports customers on their journey to net zero. Put simply, we try to help our customers answer the question, how can they be more sustainable with their energy use? The energy transition is happening, but it's not happening fast enough. Bold ambition, acceleration, and innovation is required. Electricity demand is forecast to grow by approximately 30% globally by 2040. That's big growth when you consider we're trying to be more energy efficient and we're trying to use less, or at a minimum, use renewable energy. And it's in this space that we're trying to, as SSE, innovate and drive solutions. Now, there's a few factors driving this growth. The rising global population and economic prosperity, but also you've got climate change is leading to changing demand patterns for heating across the globe as weather patterns change. Now, it's been so mild here the last few days, we've maybe been lucky for this conference, but there's obviously extreme weather we're witnessing globally. Also, the electrification of transport and heat, and the increasing requirement for data centers. We just heard about AI, but they require data centers to process that data. And with those large tech demands, that's a hot topic in Ireland at the moment, with some forecasts suggesting electricity demand in Ireland could triple between now and 2040. So while the global might be 30%, we're talking about tripling it on the island of Ireland, with data centers being a big part of that. Now, government and private sector are both investing in energy infrastructure to meet this growing demand, with recent Republic of Ireland budgets, so infrastructure investment in the energy grid to try and meet this, as well as 8 billion promised out to 2030 for national retrofit, so the energy efficiency part of things. The UK government has progressed energy policy since it's come into play in July, establishing the Great British Energy, and we'd hope to see more momentum coming to Northern Ireland very soon. Now, ambitious but not binding global targets are already in place at a global level to treble renewables by 2030. Now is the time for acute focus on the practical steps required to unlock the necessary investment on the ground in a way that, importantly, leaves nobody behind. And that's what we mean by the energy transition. The next 2 weeks will present more global targets for COP29 continues. One of the key commitments from COP28 was to double the global average annual rate of energy efficiency by 2030. Now, the funding of this, the funding of the renewable build-out, there's still a lot to be trashed out on all of that, and I think that's a lot of the discussions that are happening now. So it's a big job to do, and embracing technology and innovation will help us get there. So, propelling the energy transition. Carbon capture is essential for net zero ambitions, with power carbon capture and storage and hydrogen to power projects capable of providing crucial low-carbon flexibility capability. Blue hydrogen will be required to provide large volumes of low-carbon hydrogen in the near to medium term, and green hydrogen also has a big role to play. So last month, the UK government confirmed funding to launch carbon capture for the first time, and will be among the first to utilise this at scale. We're developing a first-of-its-kind project at our Aldborough gas storage site, which would unite hydrogen production, storage, and power generation in one location. So the concept would see green power sourced from grid through renewable PPAs. Hydrogen would then be produced via an electrolyzer before being stored in a converted salt cavern and then used in a 100% hydrogen-fired turbine, so exporting flexible green power back to grid at times of system need. Now, energy storage optimization allows us to store and supply back to the grid when it is needed the most, managing peaks of energy demand with renewable energy and balancing energy supply and demand more effectively and maximizing the potential of renewable technology to power the energy grid, even when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing. This helps fill those gaps. Now, technology, we've heard a lot about AI, is evolving at pace, and AI has a significant role across the energy value chain. AI-driven energy management systems, reducing the energy requirement for buildings, and optimizing planning analysis for the location of where do you put your renewable assets to maximize output, predictive maintenance of the grid, and overall grid optimization. AI and automation hold the potential to transform how we deliver infrastructure and energy solutions. So the transition offers an opportunity to transform how customers engage with their energy use. Demand-side management and consumption behavior is important to the future of the energy system. Key to achieving this is how we can shift demand patterns and reduce peak demand without inconveniencing the end user. Using tariffs, data, targeted communication methods will be required to provide consumers with the right signals at the right time that directly impacts the choices they make on a day-to-day basis, such as when to turn on their appliances. Now, to be really clear on that, I'm not asking people to change the time they sit down to have dinner. It needs to work with people's living patterns, and that's a really important piece. So if you imagine a world where your alarm goes off at 7 a.m., you turn off the alarm on your smartphone, which has been charged overnight using either electricity stored in your home battery, which has been charged by your solar panels the previous day, or low-cost overnight excess renewable energy. Then you make your coffee, very important for many, knowing that the energy used is clean and renewable. Then your EV charging accounts for about 30% of your household energy use. But this is charged overnight from low-cost green energy due to the fact the wind was blowing while overall market demand was low, or using your home battery to optimize the charging economics with your smart EV tariff. You drive to work knowing that you are contributing to a cleaner environment. Now, clearly, a greener solution is walking or cycling, but roll with me on this for now. When you arrive at your office, you enter a smart building that uses advanced energy management systems to optimize heating, cooling, and lighting. The building's energy efficiency design and smart technology ensures that it uses the least amount of energy possible while maintaining a comfortable environment for everyone inside. Now, it's worth noting 3/4 of the non-domestic building stock in the EU and the UK are deemed energy inefficient and could save up to 40% of energy usage by just having a building control strategy. So I think, as Chad said earlier, energy efficiency is to be had. That's an easy win. Now, in the evening, after cooking your dinner using renewable sourced energy, if you're feeling productive, you might load the washing machine. I know I don't feel like doing that after dinner either, but the machine turns on when the wind picks up, taking advantage of more renewable energy. This demand-side management technology ensures you're using the most sustainable energy sources available. At the end of the day, you reflect on how technology has seamlessly integrated into your daily life, making it more convenient, efficient, and sustainable, and gives some comfort you are doing your part to support a cleaner, greener future. This isn't some futuristic world you're imagining. Much of this is already the reality for our customers because of the innovation and advancement we are delivering. So I'll just share two quick examples with you, one from the customer business, one from the renewables business. You can see on the screen there, that's SSE's demand-side flexibility app. This is an AI platform that is hardware agnostic, across solar inverters, EVs, and EV chargers, so avoiding that hardware limiting factor. Broadly speaking, customers connect their devices such as solar panels, EVs, and home batteries. They see the energy consumption of the devices within the app and then allow AI to optimize their usage and reduce their costs. The various data feeds enable energy price, consumption, and weather to all paint a picture of how to most economically and sustainably charge your EV while making sure it's ready by 7 a.m. Through the price optimization algorithm, we're seeing some domestic customers actually saving €800 per annum on solar and batteries and up to 500 on EV charging. So considerable savings for the customer. This means as the customer, you get more value from your assets, but on scale, it also helps provide a more stable grid, and you can overlay the carbon intensity of the grid, so this will help create a more sustainable grid. Now, the role of energy flexibility for decentralized assets will become more common as long as we can deliver it through an effortless digital experience. Now, onto something quite different, but still using AI. While accelerating towards net zero, it is vitally important that we consider our impact on nature and build assets responsibly and maintain our sites in harmony with nature. SSE undertakes various ecological surveys when developing wind farms, and we carefully assess the impact on the environment and wildlife. We took this analysis to the next level of sophistication by partnering with Avignon to design and build a platform that can detect, identify, and count puffins in their natural environments. Now, the project was designed in close collaboration with NatureScot from an early stage, which was important to ensure credibility and appropriate scrutiny. The project's outcomes have been very positively received by various nature preservation groups. The data set can help to enhance conservation efforts and bridge evidence gaps concerning the impact of renewable projects on wildlife, which is really important. This can help speed up the planning process for renewable assets by providing concrete data points. So I'll just share a quick video. It's less than 2 minutes, which will bring this to life. But since this puffin project, we've extended this initiative to our hydro stations, where we monitor salmon migrations to ensure this has minimal disruption too.
This is a world's first in terms of how we are applying this technology. The project here at Dunbeath is to install a camera system for monitoring the puffin colony local to the Beatrice offshore wind farm. Previously, the counting puffins was a very manual task. So you can imagine they get to the field with a clipboard, they maybe take some photos, they have binoculars, and these activities can only take place, once or twice a year. Having a system such as this gives us monitoring for 16 hours a day, every day of the breeding season. We have 4 cameras here monitoring the puffin stack from 4 different points, and the video footage is then streamed up into the cloud, where it's processed by our AI model, which aggregates the counts from the 4 cameras to give us an overall colony count. This is a world's first in terms of how we are applying this technology. So Microsoft have used similar technology in the past for sort of one-off projects, but in terms of actual environmental monitoring, this is a world's first. Data that we're collecting from the AI model is then shared with NatureScot as part of our consent conditions for the Beatrice offshore wind farm. There are discussions around us potentially sharing this data publicly and making it available maybe via our website. We could have live streams of the cameras with the AI overlay on top and also have some statistics available. But at the moment, this data is going to be used for regulatory compliance with NatureScot.
Now, who doesn't love puffins? But to conclude, my brief today began with the energy transition demands bold innovation. And while that is true, I hope I've demonstrated these bold technologies and innovations don't have to be daunting concepts. Technology is evolving at pace, and it brings with it considerable opportunity for a more sustainable future. But controversially, perhaps, innovation is not only about the tech, but also about the customer experience. We need to make it really easy for people to make greener choices. We need to work hard to provide better outcomes for end users, be it saving money or increased comfort, as the more of this we can do, that's when we will get the groundswell of public adoption. To solve the biggest challenge facing our planet will require innovation, certainly, and strong partnerships across different businesses. We need to work together on this. There is so much more to do. I talked about some small examples of embracing innovation. I will leave you with the line on the screen that should be viewed positively and with the excitement around the opportunities that can transform our world for better. We think we are right on the cutting edge, but the reality is we are just at the beginning, considering the pace of change. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. And the puffins are just ridiculously cute, so very brave of you to show. What is it they say, never work with children or animals? Definitely not puffins. But it was really insightful talk, and it's great to have that groundwork, network even laid for the second panel of the day, whose discussion is going to centre on seizing the decarbonisation opportunity. So please will you welcome to the stage, moderating this conversation, Chad Holliday Jr., along with Chad, Dr. Stephen Ashby, who's Director of the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Debbie Caldwell, Climate Commissioner at Belfast City Council, Dr. Manny Pole, who is Chairman and CIO at EC Pole & Company, Marguerite Sayers, who's Deputy Chief Executive Officer of ESB, and Professor John Barry from Queen's University. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and really glad to be back with you. We're going to try something a little bit different on this panel. We hope you like it. So the introductions are going to be self-introductions, in addition to saying who they are. Each person is going to share one thing about themselves that probably nobody in this auditorium knows, that we hope will be interesting to you. And then after we do that, after they do that, they will also share one message on decarbonization, which is the topic of our panel, they want to make sure you have before you walk out of here. The most important thing they have to say. You want to start?
Okay. So this will be interesting. Many people know that I'm a director of a national laboratory right now, which is an honor of my lifetime, focused on how science and technology can transform society in many ways. Many people assume, therefore, I must have always wanted to go into science and technology. I'll come back to my early interest in that, but I started out as a business major because my dad was an executive in Silicon Valley, and that's what a path I should follow. But I learned early on I was more interested in the science and technology aspects of it and went there. But my roots, what you may not know, goes back to early days when I was a child in some early signs that I might be interested in science. And that was when, as a child, had an interest in electronics as well as space flight. Of course, growing up at the time, it was happening. Not having yet been educated, either in the proper use of these ideas or in how to carry them out, my friend Bob and I and a few others, we had the idea what we needed to do was send a mouse up in a balloon. It would then, so we put it in a coffee can, put air holes on the top of the coffee can, lofted it, with the assumption that the balloons would slowly lose air and the mouse would gently come down. Person would open up the coffee can, find the slip of paper with our address, and report back. Now, to track this, the electronics come into play. When we took an old walkie-talkie that you'd push the little button on to make it beep, beep, beep for Morse code, we welded that in the continuous beep sound. And we had an old World War II radio that I had from my grandfather's basement that we tuned the frequency. So we could hear this beep, beep. So we launched it, we listened. Darn school time. So went off to school, came back after school, no beep. Fast forward, I realized what happened to that poor mouseonaut is it ascended, most likely the balloons popped, and it met an untimely death due to gravity. So that's something most of you don't know about. I can trust you in my present position. We have a proper IO cook, and we do exercise proper care for the use of animals in experimentation.
So one message, besides about how to launch mouses, that you want to leave with this group today.
All right.
A small message.
The key thing is really find your passion And for many of us, it's about what we're doing to save the planet through transition to a clean energy future. When you find that passion, find others who share that passion. And I think it's important to do it in public-private partnerships, where you bring in academia, industry, others, the financial resources, and define a shared outcome and clear roles that you each bring. And when you do that, the progress you can make is remarkable. So find that passion, find people who share that passion, and go solve the problem.
Great. Debbie.
Oh, wow, how am I going to top that? Okay, I don't know if there's anyone in the audience here from Bangladesh, but the one thing that not many people know about me is that I spent 8 years living in the coastal zone of Bangladesh, and I guess that's where I developed my passion for working on climate change issues, because that is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, but it's also one of the countries that is doing some really, really exciting work on adaptation, is way, way ahead of a lot of countries like ourselves. And I spent a lot of time working in adaptation and resilience. I went to Africa after that, and then ended up back in Belfast. Actually married somebody from Northern Ireland, and they dragged me back here. And now I'm back here, I'm working on the mitigation side of the fence, and there's a lot of attention on mitigation. And what I find is that actually people don't really want to talk about resilience, even though we're living in a really, really vulnerable coastal city. So I guess that's my point about me. And I would say the one thing that I would say about decarbonisation is that we really need to take a systems approach. We need to look at the whole energy system, and we need to be way, way more integrated than we are. We're all operating in silos. If we want to act at pace and at scale, we are really going to have to do that in a much more integrated way than we're doing at the moment. And I think we have to get back into the schools and look at the way that we are educating our children about this as well.
Manny?
Well, I thought long and hard about this one, and it's always best to go back to your roots when you want to think about something that nobody knows. I'm an electrical stroke mechanical engineer by initial training, although I'm in the finance industry now. And I was designing electrical networks to provide, obviously, electrical power to communities within South Africa. I was born and brought up in South Africa. And as part of that, I decided I needed to ensure that the people that we were providing the services to were actually getting what they wanted. And in the late 80s and early 90s, I was doing house-to-house research in the middle of what was a massive revolution in South Africa with all the unrest that was going on. Not too many people know that. My wife kind of acknowledges that I was wandering around in the middle of some really unsavory conditions. But all of that work is what led to my doctorate later on. It was recognized to be kind of like very unique insights into what one should do when you're providing energy. But leading into the second question that comes out of that is that when you see people who do not have electricity and who are relying on burning wood to keep themselves warm, or they have their children with a candle that are busy using that to try and study in the evenings, you realize how much energy and the delivery of energy means to those people and how it can change their lives. And the one message that I think that we have lost in this whole debate, and we all want to take the nasties out, we all want to deliver sustainable energy, is that we have forgotten that there are a big part of our community that need cheap energy. And to the extent that we can deliver that, albeit with fossil fuels originally, but I think we can apply taxes and things and then use that to put that money into more efficient and better sustainable sources of energy is what we should be looking at. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the poor people need cheap energy. And that's about, I think that's not too many people know about my background.
Great message. Marguerite?
Thanks, Chad. Good afternoon, everybody. I don't think I know anybody here, so it should be easy enough to come up with something people don't know about me. But the item I picked on was I have a qualification in windsurfing. But Debbie's job is safe because I would challenge anybody to be a better unidirectional windsurfer. I couldn't turn the thing, so I don't know how I ended up with the qualification, but I'm clinging to it. In terms of today's discussion around decarbonisation, the thing I think is really important from my point of view, I work for an electricity company 100 years old. And we have a big role to play in terms of decarbonisation, so we need to electrify lots of heating, transport, etc. Have to connect up a lot of renewables to the grid. But we're seeing huge amounts, and people know this, there's a huge amount of objections, objecting to everything. And we can't afford to wait to work our way through the objections. So for me, there's a big job of work around public sentiment, that people understand what they're saying no to when they say no to the renewables projects and when they say no to the grid that's associated with it, that there are consequences to that, and we need to look at both sides of the equation. So against all of the scaremongering and the misinformation that's out there, it's really important to have some way of getting real information and facts to people so they can make an informed choice. So I think that's the main topic in terms of decarbonisation for me. Thanks, John.
Thank you. John?
Dia Griv Galera Cordia, Sean the Barros Anam Dunn, Ulskull Bale Firishta, August Tranona White Galera. Hello everybody, good afternoon. My name is John Barry from Queen's University. I'm the token socialist, perhaps both on this panel and perhaps in the entire conference. What you may not know about me, some of you do, I'm a recovering politician. Who would have guessed, given the way I'm dressed? I am an anxious father of two who stays awake worrying about the life chances of my children and those in other parts of the world. I think we do need more innovation, but less on technology. I think we need more social innovation, more institutional, more looking at new business models, and indeed looking at the structures of our economies, particularly in the global north, the former imperialist colonial world. We're all growed up. We don't need any more growth where we are. We need more redistribution through a decarbonised lens. And I'll leave you with this apocryphal story that many of you may know. It turns out it isn't true, but it's nonetheless informative. It's about the space race in the 1950s between the Soviets and the Americans. And the Americans spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on designing a pen that could write upside down, that could, write in sub-zero temperatures, that could be a magnet and to attach itself on the aircraft. The Russians used a pencil. And it seems to me that we need to start moving innovation beyond its narrow economic and technological focus. We are going to need that, but we're going to need new innovations in low-carbon ways of living, where it's not just about decoupling the economy from emissions and fossil fuels, but decoupling decent lives from growth itself. So for me, in a rhetorical flourish, I see the future, after 30 years of research on this issue, post-carbon, post-growth, and then horror of horrors, post-capitalism.
Well, as you can tell, John really kind of spiced up our prep meeting for this. and really hit, suggested our second topic. We'd like to have more as a discussion, not just go down the line, let's just debate. But it was around, I think you first posed it, is we're doing COP29, do we think COP30 will solve everything? Is that the answer? And it broke into a discussion about it's a little bit disorderly world out there. That we have a mammoth challenge. It hadn't gotten any easier. It's probably gotten more difficult every year. Yet the atmosphere isn't perfect, but that's the atmosphere we got. Now we got to understand that and deal with it. So who'd like to kick off that discussion?
I'll maybe kick off if you like. Just following on from John's socialism point there, I would just say...
Thank you, comrade sister.
I'm going to counter it, though, just to annoy you, John. Actually, we're seeing the rise of autocracies and tyrannical regimes all over the world now, and we are increasingly becoming more and more unstable, and we're seeing more and more geopolitical risk around the transition. But at the same time, I can see huge opportunities there with that as well. I think countries are increasingly seeing how they can become more circular, how they can diversify their energy systems a bit more. If you take Northern Ireland, for example, we've got abundant wind resources, we've got geothermal, we've got solar from time to time, and we've got a biomethane opportunity here, largely untapped. We're still a very linear economy. We're importing fossil fuels. That's a capital outflow from Northern Ireland of £9 billion per year. So there is a massive opportunity here if we actually look to minimize that geopolitical risk in some of those supply chains. We can become way more circular and way more diversified, and that would really boost our own economy. So I do think there's a big opportunity there.
Well, oh, go ahead. I'll say thank you for introducing a new element to the discussion. I will not embrace socialism as a solution. I want to go back to Chad's earlier point today, and I'll bring to the power of science and technology to really part of the solution. And I think that if you look at it, one of the big problems we have in addition to the upheaval we're talking about, I agree there's too much of an inclination towards authoritarianism as a solution. I do think we have to look at the amount of debt the world is accumulating out of as government spending. And therefore, I think turning to the government as a solution to fund what's necessary in this transition, I think is looking at empty coffers. Instead, what we need to do is finding a way of using capitalism with proper respect for individuals and their needs, using capitalism to incentivize the private sector to fund this transition, which means that the clean energy transition is not a cost, it is an opportunity that we can embrace in terms of creation of new jobs, high technologies, and the such. That gets back to the optimism I talked about, dead mice notwithstanding. And that is about the ability to really use science and engineering to come up with novel solutions. And I do believe, and that was part of my question to the person about AI, that humans have a creative bent in us because of our curiosity as a species, is why I'm optimistic that we can find the solutions. But we need to find the format or the platform in which they can flourish economically to create the jobs that will lift people out of poverty, provide the energy that is directly correlated to prosperity around the planet, and do that in ways that make sure the planet is here for COP60. All right, so I think these are some of the things, and I think the answer is going to lie in innovation, making that profitable, and but being mindful that we're doing this to lift people out of poverty and to be a prosperous species going forward.
Well, Stephen, I'm on your side of the fence, and I hope Professor Cox is wrong about other planets having sustainable life, because if your view's right, I need to get on the first shuttle out here. But one point that comes to mind is one you made earlier on with regards to security of supply. And as we're going into this carbon-free world, we've got to be sure that we don't compromise national security in terms of when we get there, we're going to need innovation. And I'm mindful years ago by a particular person who addressed a group of us called Jack Schmidt. Now, a lot of the people are looking at me saying, who the hell's Jack Schmidt, which was my response when I was invited to the dinner where he was going to talk. But he's the last astronaut to have walked on the moon. And there were a number of things in his speech, but the one point that he made was that out of the samples that they were sent to the moon to collect, a lot of the minerals and resources that we're short of on this planet are actually on the moon, but the problem is getting them back here economically. So I hope over the next 10 years we can be innovative and figure out how to get things from the moon, because then it might solve a lot of the problems that we've got, particularly sourcing things from other regimes on the planet.
There is a battle for sure around minerals at the moment, but that's straight away, I think, a little bit from our question, which was around COP. So I actually had the same conversation. I drove up to Belfast from Dublin this morning, and I was having the same kind of conversation with myself as to whether this is going to make any difference at all. And the second thing I thought is, it doesn't seem that long since the last one. But I think for me, if you don't have that conversation, at least it brings attention to it. So every bit of customer research we do at the moment tells us that the whole idea of the whole issue of climate change, even though people are worried about it in terms of their day-to-day actions, it's now down somewhere between number 5 and number 10 of the things that are most important to them. So if there's anything that continues to bring focus to climate change and debate, then I think it's not going to do any harm. I think it's important. And the second thing that I think is important about it is that it gives developing countries a voice. And there isn't another forum that I'm aware of that gets that amount of attention. And there's a huge opportunity here for developing countries, because they don't have the sort of historic fossil fuel problem in a lot of cases that we've got in the developed world, so they can actually leapfrog. So back to your point, I think there's an opportunity here maybe for more social justice and more equality of opportunity in the middle of this energy transition. That said, I think the estimates by the IEA for the cost of the energy transition plus what we're spending on renewables grid, etc., is about 4 trillion euros per annum, which is absolutely huge, and there's no way that developing countries are going to be able to manage without some assistance from developed world. So there's an opportunity in there, but there's a level of financial investment that's going to be needed, and certainly I think the World Bank again could play a big role, but there are other ways of balancing out the availability of renewables, the availability of those minerals, the opportunity for developing countries, the minerals that are in developing countries, and have a fairer answer at the end of the transition. But it's going to take a lot of coordination, and if anything was to come out of COP, I would hope that that would.
I mean, my point I was making was we've had over 30 years since 1992 of these COPs, and greenhouse gas emissions have increased. So you could say it's been a failure. But I think if it hadn't been there, we'd be in a worse position than we're in now. But being 3 foot underwater this year as opposed to 10 foot last year, what sort of progress is that? So there's a serious issue to be looked at in terms of how do we make these international climate negotiations more real. And I think we have to talk about climate reparations. You know, big figures have been thrown around. $1 trillion is how much the world subsidised fossil fuel every year, if you look up at the International Monetary Fund. How much do we spend on armaments? I don't buy the argument that governments don't have the money. Have you ever wondered? There's always money for war, but not for our health service. Our governments in the West could fund a genocidal regime in a part of the world or give Vladimir Zelensky the weapons he needs to fight Putin, but we can't provide the assets. Do we think that President Roosevelt in America or Winston Churchill in England, facing the Nazi threat, said, ooh, how are we going to raise the funds? War bonds did not pay for the war, folks. The state, like the UK or America, does not have any limit on the capacity to create money. What there is a limit on is real resources. In my view, the proper framing is not climate change, it's a climate catastrophe. There are hundreds of thousands of people dying right here, right now, as a result, just happening in other parts of the world. We need a wartime mobilization. Look at the pandemic. A science-led response, yes, it was uneven in terms of the epidemiological evidence informing how governments reacted. Why is it, when we've had over 4 decades of climate science on this issue, indicating to governments we need to move away from fossil fuels as quickly and as equitably as we can, we aren't seeing the same reaction? So for me, I don't buy the argument there isn't the money, there isn't the political will. I have fairly low hopes of what's going to happen in Baku this year, particularly because we need to start recognising that climate reparations and climate justice, both between countries and within them, it's essentially how are we going to deal with the displaced Appalachian coal worker, the displaced oil worker in Aberdeen in Scotland. And the reason why I say that, just to finish, is from, in my view, as a socialist, fascism of what we see happening around the world now is when capitalism is in decline, the turbulence that has been referred to. Look at the regions, particularly in Germany and Poland, that are supporting far-right parties, and they are those coal mining regions. So this is not just like a biophysical issue in terms of an existential crisis on the planet. It is causing deep political divisions in our society. But this has to be a state coordinated. I agree there's going to be a role for the private sector in this, but we need the patient capital of the state to lay down the infrastructure of this. And why don't we see enough in our discussions around decarbonisation of the electricity system? And I take it an audience like this doesn't need to know. The future we're talking about, folks, is the electrification of almost everything in our lives in terms of production of the energy that we need. But why is it we don't see the discussion of the democratization of the energy means of production as part of this? I think that would get us around the legitimate concerns often local communities have about objecting to wind or wave or solar. Here ended the secular sermon.
Given the level of applause, I think I'm in the wrong hall.
Maybe you've got the right colour tie on. Next door.
And I didn't realize that this was a platform for a political debate. But I would say that one of the things we need to, and you made the point earlier, that we need to speed up the process of approval of a lot of these projects because they're not delivering what they should in the time frame that people are envisaging. But I would urge us to be careful because there's been a number of projects that we've been approached to put money into, which we would have because it was a social license and it was really a feel-good project. But in speeding up the approval process, they didn't follow the norms of what it was doing to the environment and to nature. And within a few years, particularly one which was a wind farm, when they were dredging the area to put in the bases, they actually destroyed a natural habitat for a whole lot of fish where they were using it to spawn, and the fish stock started to decline dramatically. So we've got to be careful of the unintended consequences of what we're doing and not just throw away all of the rules that we've put in place over many years, but actually just think about them carefully.
So let me come back to a point. Maybe we'll go to a different room later on this, but I think part of the answer to your question, John, I want to bring back to decarbonization and where we have the difficulty, in my opinion, of motivating people. So you go back to the war, and there you're seeing, and people could see and feel an existential threat to the nation and their lives. It was very real and was able to be mobilized. And you had different institutions that were trusted by the public at the time. Fast forward to today, I think part of the problem we have when we look at climate, it's a classic frog boiling. All right, and I think there, most people don't see the existential threat that climate change, the climate catastrophe represents to them or even to their children. And it gets back to also Maslow's hierarchy. Right now, you have too many people around the world, even in a country as wealthy as the United States, who are more worried about what can they do to meet ends day to day than worried about what's happening to the planet maybe a century from now. And so I think what we have to do is free-frame this. And I think, yes, the government can catalyze some of these changes, but real success is going to depend on leveraging the vast wealth of private capital. And what we need to do is motivate people to see that in the way that people believe that education is the ticket to the future, they need to see that clean energy is an opportunity for their children. And we have to find a way of making them see that and want it and demand it of their politicians. And I think when I get this, I see the opportunity when we go into schools for children and try to excite them about careers and opportunities in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, as part of that solution. Whether it's fundamental discovery, like we saw from the talk today earlier from Dr. Cox, because we're curious species, to energy solutions we're talking about now, or to national security solutions. I, for one, it goes back to my first part of the answer to your question, I really do believe in the power of science and technology to be part of that solution with appropriate guardrails on how we're using it. And I think that's how we're going to decarbonize the planet. We've got to make it much more real to people, and we've got to get them invested through their children's future in doing this.
If I may just come back to that role of the state and the role of the public sector versus the private sector, we need both. We need the two to work arm in arm with each other, but if we're looking at cold hard facts here, look at the public sector productivity hasn't risen in the UK since 1992. Over that same period, private sector productivity has risen by 50%. So we need the private sector, we need private capital, but we also need the state to play its role in providing that enabling environment and making sure that we have that fair transition. So we need those partnerships to kind of work effectively. And then when we look at the role of the state in decarbonisation, there's a huge role there for public procurement. The public sector is sitting on huge land banks, which could be hosting a lot of low carbon infrastructure. It's got a massive procurement footprint, so we could be kind of going for performance contracts, power purchase arrangements, heat supply agreements. All those sort of things are some of the changes that need to happen in the public sector to be able to kind of accelerate that transition to net zero.
One point that I'd like to pick up on also from John, sorry, I'm jumping in, I think you were going to talk, is this issue of patient capital. All of the mandates that we have are taken with a view at least for 5 years and maybe 10 years in terms of where we invest. But the interesting thing is that all of the mandates are subject to 24-hour notice. And then we say of our clients, how can there be a reconciliation between us investing for 5 years and you have the ability to switch it off in one day? But that's just a matter for the lawyers to sort out. But certainly patient capital is a really important issue, particularly with new technologies. And while, as we were saying earlier, the governments around the world are a bit short of capital, they've been living from hand to mouth for quite a long time. There are these sovereign wealth funds that exist, particularly as Charles spoke earlier about the one in Australia. And as part of their charter, I would think that one should have a certain component that is there to provide patient capital for new technologies that are being developed, and that doesn't exist. So that's a pool of capital that should be utilized, which has got long-term thinking in it. I mean, all of the sovereign wealth funds are thinking 10, 20, 40 years, but they're not putting their capital into these kind of projects that I can see.
Marguerite, the last point on this question.
Just on that point, and also back to another point that John made, I'm not sure how we create that international sense of urgency, because you're right, the pandemic is a real case in point, and it's that kind of story of the frog in the warm water that's heating up slowly, which might be a bad analogy here, but also when you put a frog into boiling water, they jump out. So the pandemic was the frog jumping out, and the whole world got invested in finding a solution. And the whole world is not invested in finding a solution to climate change, and there's still debate as to whether it exists or not. Not with most people, but there's still a few. So I don't have the answer, but I don't know how we get that sense of urgency and everybody coalesce to all of the various interests, because it is in everybody's interest, not just because of the climate, for health reasons and for wealth reasons. There's all sorts of reasons to have the climate transition, to change to renewables, to make sure that we don't harm the planet anymore, and people are not. Is it because it's too big? People can't get their arms around it. It's too scary. People feel that somebody else has to solve it, it's not them. But I don't know how or what the vehicle is to create that sense of urgency. Just as a question, I don't know.
And there's a really short other question. Why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism?
Slightly different question.
So the last question that we want to work today is we're having trouble getting to this 2050 decarbonized world, so I'm just going to assume it's going to happen. So take as an assumption we're out in 2050, we have decarbonized, and I'd like our panel to answer two questions. On the assumption it happened, how do you think we got there? And how would you have liked to got there? Was it you like the way it's going to happen? Or you have another way that you think would have been much better for the world beyond 2050? Who'd like to take that one first?
I'll jump in. So I like your optimism. We'll get there in 2050. We'll start with that premise. We can challenge that later, perhaps over drinks tonight. I think the way we're going to get there, and I am optimistic about it, and it's going to be a surprise given the role I play, is through the proper harnessing of science and engineering. Let me give a couple examples why I think this is not, an idle dream. So we're looking at things going back to a comment I think you made about critical minerals, right? So already we know we're motivated. We need energy storage if we're going to incorporate renewables onto the grid. So one of the things we're doing in our laboratory is looking at energy storage at scale, grid scale storage. If you look at flow battery technology, a lot of it's based on toxic and or rare earth minerals and materials, where the supply chain controllers are not friendly to some of our interests. One of our research challenges that we've set upon is looking at, can we get away from rare earths to earth-abundant materials? Can we get away from precious metals to cheaper minerals? And the answer is yes. So some of our chemists, for example, found a flow battery that works on fluorine, which is the material you find in candles. Another promising avenue is simply by adding a dissolved sugar to certain things, we can get much safer, longer-lasting batteries. So there's a lot of fundamental research. But what's necessary is to frame the question in terms of what you're looking at is you want a new battery material with certain capabilities, certain features. That leads you away from a certain path towards another one. So properly framing the question is important. I think when you look at, the power of AI to help accelerate that process of scientific discovery, that's the partnership we've got going on with Microsoft. So I think two things. It's going to be innovation, it's going to be partnerships that are going to get us to that future. Unfortunately, along the way, and now I may be playing into John's point, I do think as we get there, it's going to be because we've motivated private capital. And the risk, unless we put in the proper incentives and regulatory environment, is that we're going to get there in a way that's going to increase wealth inequity, all right, and lead to more and more disparity that could fuel social unrest. What I'd like to see us do is get beyond where we are today with our governments, more to setting level playing fields that really are about, we want to get a decarbonized future, and let's make sure we're not tilting the playing field in any one direction, and make sure that we recognize that as human beings playing on this, and AIs are going to be our servants, not the other way around.
Very good. Who's next?
I'll go if you like. Yeah, I think we're going to get there too, and I think the one thing that I think will change is the way that we deal with waste streams, and I think we're going to get better and better at kind of sweating the assets and making as much use out of every waste stream that comes out and recycling that and moving to a much more circular economy. And the reason I think that's going to happen is because you can make profit out of doing that, and it's way more efficient to do that, and that's why I think that's going to happen. I think that's the way forward, and yeah, that's it.
Great, perfect.
I agree with Stephen that we're going to have to rephrase the question a little. Yes, we all want to get to the decarbonized environment in 2025 or whenever it is, but we have to provide cheap energy to those that need it. That has to be part of that has to be a caveat. But in answer to your question, the only way we're going to get to 2025, as Charles said, is we've got to get the Australian government to decide that we can unlock those vast nuclear resources, and then we'll get there. Because without that, I think we're not going to have sufficient nuclear material to be able to generate the power that we need.
I think we'll get there as long as there isn't a nuclear war that annihilates most of us before then, because the world is very unstable at the moment. And I also think, I don't know what it is, but I think some number of catastrophes will happen that will actually increase the pace. So I do think something will happen to coalesce people around a faster solution and a faster rollout and a realization we do need to do something more quickly, because it's not going quickly enough at the moment. I don't know what that is, and it'll be painful, but I think something will happen. But I do think if we're around, we'll get there.
I have two visions. One is an unjust transition based around green growth myths for the global north, and the other one is a different vision of a just transition, both internally and between societies globally. The unjust transition is a kind of a green extractivism, a kind of neo-colonial perspective where we in the global north will be green and decarbonised at the expense of the damage that's going to be caused in other parts of the world. And I'm particularly exercised by the fact that, as probably many of you know, the single biggest driver now of enforced involuntary migration is not wars, it's not because of your political or religious perspective, it's the climate crisis. And that's only going to increase in the future. And I can see a vision of this unjust transition. Take your pick of the movies I'm going to offer. You know, A Few Good Men is one, where Jack Nicholson, in that great speech, says, "You need walls." And look at the way in which Europe is reacting to the migration crisis. That gives you a sense of perhaps what might be ahead of us in terms of how we deal with climate migration. Or the other movie is Elysium, this kind of science fiction film, where an elite live this idyllic, low-carbon, beautiful world at the expense of those elsewhere. I think that's a very real possibility. And I do fear of the militarization of this issue, the way in which energy security switches from being an economic issue to actually being a very clear military issue. The other version of the future is around the alliances that perhaps might be created within and between societies, between faith communities. What would Jesus drive? What would Jesus eat? What would Muhammad, bless his name, eat? Where are our faith communities in this time? Where are our trade unions, our business communities, and so on, who are willing to countenance decoupling a better human life from the current economic system and energy system that we have? I mean, I'm constantly amazed, and I can feel the tension in the panel on the room, and I felt this all my life about questioning this economic system that we have, particularly under its neoliberal globalized form. For me, there is no empirical evidence, if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as that we can achieve the types of at-pace, rapid decarbonisation, a movement beyond this ecocidal system that we currently have at pace. I mean, just look at the increasingly, strident tones of the UN General Secretary, Antonio Guterres. Everything, everywhere, all at once. That will involve everybody in this room, the public sector, the private sector, civil society. But what I'm not seeing is the political leadership that we should be presenting this radical transition, and I appreciate the decarbonisation within a green capitalist, green growth perspective is much more palatable to take because it's much more understandable. I cannot see empirical evidence that's the path we're going to go down, folks, by the way, until we find out that it doesn't actually work. And I think it's going to be done in this kind of global apartheid way that I've described. I hope I'm wrong, and you can invite me back in 20 years' time, and I'll happily be parade naked here and eat my hat, although there's a vision that you might want to have. You've suffered enough, probably, from my rantings. But I think we have to be open to the prospect. Why is it that if you look at the West's military, whether it's the US, the UK, or the German Bundeswehr, they are very interested in this whole issue because they can see they are the ones that are going to have to invade other countries for perhaps resources. The war in Iraq from 2 decades ago was a war for oil. That's just not me as a woke university professor. That's Alan Greenspan, former Fed chief. That was a war for oil. So one of the many advantages of decarbonisation has been mentioned already in terms of the turbulence. We would have a much more geopolitically unstable world. Although I do sometimes stay awake at night, not just worrying about my kids, but worrying, can we have future wars over wind turbines? I don't know. But I definitely think we'd have a safer world if we actually move in this direction. And part of our problem is not just political leadership, but also for people like me, coming from a more radical perspective. The vision that we present often is very difficult for people to understand, and also it's often phrased, particularly by our opponents, those who deny climate is happening, or those who want to delay it, or those who say that we can deal with it in our current economic system, is that it's a language of sacrifice. So I see if we make this transition, we're all eating a lot more plant-based diets, folks. It turns out this is the best form of diet for the planet and for ourselves. There's probably a lot more staycations. We've relocalized or selectively deglobalized supply chains. There's a lot more energy security because of indigenous sources of energy that many people here on the panel have talked about. So the world I see in the future is very different than the one we have now. So it is the end of the world as we know it. But relax, it's not the end of the world. It's just the end of the world as we know it.
It's always hard to follow you, John, but it's good. So we've got just 3 minutes left. So I want to go kind of fast. And this is a question you weren't expecting. You're able to sit down with your 6-year-old granddaughter, grandson, son, or daughter, depending on what age bracket you are now, and you could give them one message about climate change, decarbonization, that you want them to hold. What would that one message be? Go ahead, Steve.
Well, neither one of my children have yet had grandchildren, so let's see how this is going to go. Also, I'm resonating with John's, so I'm much more hopeful. And I would tell them that I think that there's an opportunity for us to make this transition. I think it will be the end of the world as we know it, but it won't be the beginning of the world as John envisions it. And I think there is an opportunity here for us to really make that transition to a more prosperous world and still enjoy a good steak and a bottle of wine from Washington's Columbia Valley.
Yeah, I mean, I think the transition will happen. I think there's an economic imperative. I think there's a moral imperative. I think the issue is a lot of the temperature rise is already baked in. So we're going to surpass 1.5 degrees, and we're going to be looking at more like 2 to 3 degrees by the end of the century. So I guess my message is, get ready, be adaptable, be resilient, make sure that kind of you're ready for the future.
I would say to my grandkids, don't forget where you've come from and don't demonize the past. And we've got to where we are as a human race because we have used fossil fuels. And they've obviously overstayed their welcome, and we have to figure out the next journey going forward. But I would not demonize where we've got to, because without it, we would still be sitting in a cave with those rocks that were referred to earlier.
I think I would say that all of your choices matter. People sometimes think one person can't make a difference, but the collective of all of those choices makes a big difference, and it can influence other people as well. So not to be afraid to make the right choices, not be afraid to talk about them.
And I would say always be hopeful. One of my concerns is that there's too much hopium, which is a kind of a version of optimism, and let me explain. Optimism is the happy thought that it's all going to work out fine. We can outsource the issue to Elon's got it. Well, if it doesn't work out SpaceX, we always have electric cars to depend upon. But what we say in Ireland here, it'll be grand. Well, my view is that it won't be grand, because we need hope, and hope requires two things. One is that it's agency. What are we going to do? Optimism is too passive. It also, I would say, and I see this in my students, an apocalypticism, that it's too late. And that is also passive, which I would also reject. So we need to have a sense of agency, but we also have to hold the shadow side of hope, which you've kind of got a flavour of from some of our discussions. To be truly hopeful, you have to hold in full possibility that we may fail. Otherwise, it's not hope. And that's why I think we need to, read, if you haven't, the wonderful poem by Václav Havel, the former Czech president and playwright, who wrote a poem on this issue, in terms of that what we need to inculcate, particularly in our younger generation, is hope. But we also need to be honest with people. As James Baldwin, the great American African novelist and activist, said, not everything that is faced can be overcome, but nothing can be overcome until it's faced. So let's start facing up to the truth, not throw our hands up in the air, but start rolling up our sleeves and get to it.
If I could make a suggestion based on the last question to everyone here, and it's something I actually have done with my two granddaughters that are slightly older, 6, but about that age range. Just sat down one-on-one and had a conversation about this subject and said, what questions do you have and what ideas do you have? I found I learned a lot from both of those sessions. So I urge you to have a conversation with somebody about that age, because it's really important to have their perspective, what's going on. It might surprise you how good it is. Thank you very much, panel. Appreciate it.
And a big thank you to Chad and to our panel for another very engaging and thought-provoking session. Now we have a terrific speaker coming up next. Minette, now Baroness Batters, was the first woman to lead the National Farmers Union of England and Wales, a passionate and influential voice on the future of farming, particularly in the context of food security, climate change, and post-Brexit Britain. Minette has played a pivotal role in promoting sustainable farming practices and influencing agricultural policy, both nationally and internationally, as well as massively raising the profile of the Farmers' Union that she represented. As we would say here, some woman for one woman. We're delighted to have you here today, Minette, to discuss how bridging food security and One Health is pivotal to society. Please welcome the Right Honourable, the Baroness Minette Batters.
Wendy, thank you so much, and what a huge privilege it is to be here with you today. I've got a lot I want to say, and I've tried to condense it into sort of 5 themes effectively, and I think it's always quite confusing from a UK perspective. Are we one country? Well, we sort of are, but we are very much 4 nations, and there's always a bit of rivalry, I think, between those 4. So I was intrigued on my flight out here today. I fly up to Scotland quite a bit, and you get a shortbread biscuit. And if you're flying to Scotland, it's a Walker's shortbread biscuit. And it's always, it's got the tartan on it, and it's very much part of the Scottish brand. And it's made with Irish butter. And I get on the plane to come here today, and I've got Irish shortbread made with Irish butter. And just to make you, or make me aware that I'm in Ireland, I had to pay for it as well. So look, it's great to be here. As I say, there's a lot I want to cover. First of all, I want to start by saying that I had no intention of ever being president of the NFU. I had no intention of ever being in the House of Lords, and I had no intention of ever becoming an associate professor of the Nottingham Food Institute. So I feel that everything that has happened to me over the last 10 years has not been planned in any shape or form. I set out to farm. That was my passion in life. It was not a given that I would do that. My father was very opposed to me doing that, but that was my passion. That was what I wanted to do. And that, amongst those other things, is what I am still doing. I am a farmer, I am a mum, and I trained as a chef, so food is a big passion of mine as well. But my time at the NFU, I saw extraordinary and enormous and in some ways unprecedented change, and I want to try and bring that to life for you a bit. I represented 46,000 farmers across England and Wales, everyone effectively from James Dyson and Jeremy Clarkson to a small sheep farmer on a Welsh hillside, and everybody in between, a really, really diverse industry. Jeremy Clarkson, who is fast becoming what Elon Musk is to tech, Jeremy Clarkson is becoming that to farming and getting a global reputation as well. But it's really difficult when you are representing such enormous diversity. And I was really struck by what Daniel said earlier and the power of AI to transform the lived situation effectively. And I have had so much engagement on AI and challenges around future workforce. And we're still a long way from mirroring the dexterity of the human hand. AI can do it, robots can do it, but it can't do it anywhere near at the speed that the human hand can do it. And that is going to take time, no matter how fast AI goes. As far as agriculture goes, as far as food goes, it's really reliant on taught and lived experience. It can't just happen. The NFU is very much an organization led by farmers for farmers. So for me, being able to talk from my own farming experience and bringing all those different case studies to life of the different people was really important as a lobbyist, as a trade association. But we were backed by technical expertise with our professional staff. So 700 professional people working on policy solutions every single day of the year, effectively. Probably the change that I brought was the need I felt to campaign a lot more. There's many women in this audience, and you'll be aware that being the first is a real hospital pass. Actually, nobody wants to be the first, because the danger is, if you are the first, you can also be remembered for being the worst. And I really wanted to leave the runway clear so that my success story was future women being president of the National Farmers Union. But I wanted to talk today about my belief around One Health equals hope. I think so much of the political landscape, so much of the world that we inhabit today is bereft of hope. And we talk a lot about taxation and stick to drive change. My goodness, do we need to empower the culture of hope on this journey? And this is food, right? This is fundamental to life. So there's got to be a lot of hope along that journey, and a lot of hope as well as a bit of stick that will drive the changes that are needed. So my focus at the NFU was very much working on optimization. And of course, the One Health approach, it is about achieving that balance, but the optimization of the health of people, of animals, and of ecosystems at a local, national and global level. And one of the things I was most proud of was our input to the World Farmers Organization. And believe you me, there is no farmer anywhere in the world that is living in the land of milk and honey. We all face very, very similar challenges, but we are all operating in very different circumstances. But ultimately, We need the same things. And there is a lot, I think, of unity in operating at a global level, but really drilling down into that local and national level as well. So much as we were focused on policy solutions for every single thing that affected agriculture and food, we were also focused on campaigning. And in my time, I worked with 6 secretaries of state in 6 years, and I worked with 4 prime ministers, and 3 of them in 1 year. And they could not, believe you me, I'm sure you've seen it play out in the news, they could not have been more different. So enormous challenges to be relevant to them. In that time, we went on a journey of actually food doesn't matter at all. We're going to focus on biodiversity targets. We're going to take land out of production, to the world that we live in now, which was a very different world to the world that we inhabited pre the UK's departure from the European Union. I've kept my slides, as you will see, extremely simplistic. I don't want to show you lots of graphs. I just want to bring to life some of the things that I have learned on this journey of the last 10 years, and some of the people who I think have been incredibly important to shaping where we are today, that have enormous impact on the road that we're going on. Now, I'm sure many of you in this audience remember this piece of work, The Perfect Storm, the Foresight Report. There are 2 men, really, that I want to refer to in what I say now. Of course, it was Sir John Beddington, the government chief scientist, who brought together this piece of work, globally renowned. Because in 2008, when we faced the global financial disaster, there were serious concerns about where our food was going to come from, the uprising of the Arab Spring, and we needed to collaborate and come together. And we needed to double food production for a population by 2050 that was set to rise to 10 billion people. And we needed to do it with half the energy and half the water. So we needed to produce more food on less land. It was when I first really started to get involved with the NFU that I saw this piece of work, and I was completely absorbed by it and have been ever since. And I have been astounded at how it now sits on a shelf gathering dust, effectively. And on that journey of mine, working with many different secretaries of state, one time Therese Coffey was the Secretary of State in DEFRA, and I said to her, literally 2 years ago, I said, why don't you have a look at the Foresight Report? That was explaining the challenges that we face. And I said, Sir John Beddington was actually bang on the money, the perfect storm of 2030, except it's a few years early, geopolitics, climate change, water security, energy security, all colliding, creating the perfect storm. So that report was finalized in 2011-12. When I mentioned it to her in 22-23, not one person in that department, in DEFRA, remembered that piece of work. Now that, to me, was absolutely extraordinary, because everything that John and globally we were trying to achieve was what we need to achieve now. So had we stayed on that path, we would have been better prepared than we are now. But we didn't, because what happened? After the financial crash, the markets took off, and the line was, and the line still is in the UK, don't worry, we're a wealthy nation, we can import our food. Now, how sensible does that look in today's world? It really doesn't look very sensible at all. And I'll take you back to the One Health approach of where we need to go and how we need to get there. The second person I'd reference who in my lifetime has made, I think, probably more substantive change, really, than anyone else. And that is Norman Borlaug, who, don't forget, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973. He was an eclectic, pragmatic, but most importantly, goal-orientated scientist. What needed to happen on the ground was always his focus. He's well known for being critical, and only he could be, I couldn't be, but he used to call butterfly academics, i.e. people that were focused on on the things that could be done, might be done, and the money to do it, but where was the goal to lead that change? So a plant breeder extraordinaire. Over 1 billion people worldwide were saved from starvation because of his actions. Primarily, I think the focus in the early days was Mexico, to get Mexico to self-sufficiency in wheat. Within 8 years, Mexico was self-sufficient in wheat. It just shows what a pioneer can do, but we need the new Norman Borlaug. You know, he started the Green Revolution, but my goodness, do we need to take the next steps from where he was then to where we are now? But he had his critics, and actually, if you look now, there are a lot of critics of what he did. You know, a lot of people saying that, you know, his time led to this enormous challenge and damage to ecosystems and biodiversity. Food production, by its very nature, is, of course, damaging. Of course it leaves a footprint. But that work of Beddington was all about lightening the footprint. How do we lighten the footprint, but how do we produce more? And that remains the same challenge, except it's getting urgent. It is getting urgent now to be able to deliver on what's needed. Now, if you'd asked me 3 weeks ago, was I going to talk about Africa? I would have said, no, probably not. But I have been an ambassador for Farm Africa. I have been a trustee of Farm Africa, which is a UK-based charity, and is doing extraordinary things in East Africa, which is where effectively the poorest in the world are living. Last year alone, Farm Africa touched the lives of 718,000 people. When I say touched, also transformed the lives of 718,000 people. If I look at maize productivity, it has quadrupled from where it was 10 years ago. That means that rural families are now 3 times as well off as they were, that they are now feeding urban communities as well. I've talked about Farm Africa. I've run in 3 marathons for Farm Africa. I've raised well over £100,000 with colleagues at the NFU for this charity. Nothing prepared me for going to Africa. We went to Embu County. It's about a 2-hour drive from Nairobi. It's one of the poorest parts of Kenya. It's totally reliant on subsistence agriculture. And we were set a challenge that we were going to cycle to all of these farms, we were going to camp, and then we were going to work on the farms. And I naively thought, it's probably going to be a bit boring, you know, we'll do a bit of gardening, and we'll bike maybe a few miles. Forget it. We cycled on dirt tracks with massive altitude challenges right at the foot of Mount Kenya. We cycled 20 miles every day. We worked in the heat of the day for 6 hours on these farms, and then we camped at night. And when I say camped, I mean camped. It was extraordinary, and it changed my thoughts on Africa. It changed my thoughts on everything in some ways. And if you're going to have a view on Africa, my first piece of advice was you have to go there. You cannot have a view on Africa unless you have been there. And probably the biggest lesson I came back with, having been someone that felt, well, if they have a phone, knowledge transfer, we can teach them so much. Well, how wrong was I? Actually, they can teach us so much. And they could teach us so much because they do not have the luxuries that we have. So these things matter to them. It matters that they take out synthetic inputs, because if they take out synthetic inputs, they take out huge cost. So if they are farming in an organic way, in a sustainable way, if they are taking out those chemical inputs, but they need to produce more, like what I've said about maize productivity. So I just want to touch on one person, really, Juliet, who was the last farmer that we met. She moved back to Embu County in COVID. She didn't know how to farm. She'd been left this small amount of land. She didn't know how to farm. She had 2 children. And she learned through Farm Africa how to farm. And she's now making 2 lots of compost every week, which she's selling for 15,000. Kenyan shillings for every piece of compost that she makes, and they are big. I helped her make them. They are enormous plots of compost. But she's mulching, she's farming in a way that we have lost sight of in many other parts of the world, because she is using biology effectively in every single part of her business. What was rubbish is now being composted and put to good use. There are threats, and this again is where I urge you to be real in the challenges that we face today. There are threats to land use. And the big threat in Kenya that I saw, that was, I think, a challenge to subsistent agriculture that has not been fully understood. There is a new purchaser of land. In the UK, we are seeing a lot of private equity businesses coming in, purchasing land. We are seeing a lot of people look to offset their carbon emissions. We are looking a lot of people wanting to deal with their ESG requirements. But a lot of people are focusing on land use for other things than producing food. So what was going on in Embu County? A lot of cat was being grown. Cat is a sort of cocaine substitute, but there were huge areas of land that were going into the production of cat. I saw escarpments going down into the river that had been cleared completely of vegetation to grow this cat. It's a category C drug. And when the rains come, it will be raining there now, it's the rainy season, those escarpments are just going to flood. They're going to come right down into the river. And the route for Africa has to be about empowering these farmers to farm. So they face, in many ways, the same challenge. And the more we say, well, farming doesn't matter, subsistence agriculture is over, these people, these communities, they do matter because ecosystems and food are completely reliant on them. So, Brexit, the green Brexit. One of the challenges that I faced at the NFU, working with Michael Gove, some of you will know him well, some of you won't know him at all, but he was a very renowned UK government politician. He was very much part of the Vote Leave campaign, and he was very much part of, we don't need to produce food anymore, we're going to take land out of production, we're going to rewild it, we're going to introduce new species, and we're going to forget about food production. Now, what I said to you in the beginning about campaigning, and I hate to turn net zero into a campaign, but actually it needs to be. So many sectors say to me, well, decarbonisation just really isn't a sexy subject. It might not be a sexy subject, but it's an essential subject. And I wanted to open doors. And these doors were locked to us by the Climate Change Committee, by the UK government. Agriculture was an emitter. It is an emitter. 10% of emissions in the UK are from agriculture. Can we do something about it? My goodness, yes we can. We cannot decarbonise unless agriculture is front and centre at the heart of it. So what we agreed that I would say back in 2019 is we can, with the right policies and the right incentives, we can beat the government target of 2050 and hit net zero by 2040. We didn't really say much more than that, but that strategy worked. And I'll tell you why it worked. Everybody flung open the doors and asked the question we wanted them to ask. My goodness, that's amazing. How are you going to do it? That's all you want people to ask. How are you going to do it? And that allowed us then, as a policy, science and evidence-led organization, to work up the policies for how we're going to achieve carbon neutral food production. Now, I've said on many platforms, it's really simple, actually. Produce nothing, emit nothing. Job done. We can't do that. And there is a real opportunity now, I believe, and I really hope that the UK will become a global leader in climate-smart agriculture. Now, there'd be dangers of the NFU being vested interest. If it just designed its own policy, how is that going to be credible? What is that going to achieve? So we pulled together a scientific and academic panel to benchmark against the farming panel, so that this is real time, that this is transformative. Is it having effect? Is the UK government thinking differently? I can't say that it is. My time and my time going forwards has been, as I see it, about moving the dial. painfully, slowly, further forwards in the right direction. But if we don't move the dial painfully, slowly, further forwards in the right direction, what then? We wait for another emergency. We wait for another Borag moment where 1 billion people are starving, or we have a financial crash. Why can't we be prepared and keep investing and keep getting the policies right so that we are fully optimized? We can do this. I remain as excited about the journey as I has ever been. I remain frustrated, not necessarily just the politicians, but with the machinery behind governments, that has become probably more risk-averse to the decisions that need to be made. And I would make a lot of comparisons with the energy sector, whereby we have pump-primed it globally in different ways. We have pump-primed it to achieve the outcome that we want. In many cases, it has exceeded, renewable energy, certainly in the UK, has exceeded the capabilities that anybody thought were possible. And we have to do the same with food. I really believe that our economic framework for delivering on biodiversity targets, for developing new trades on water quality, biodiversity, and eventually carbon credits, that economic model does not exist, and it cannot be a desktop exercise. This has to be real time. It has to be based on data that is real. It has to be farmer-led and farmer-owned. And actually, we can do that. I'm part of a cooperative that is doing exactly that on a whole catchment. I think there are really exciting things going on in the US. Certainly under the last Trump administration, when I was out with Secretary of State Vilsack at the COP, actually in Glasgow, he was talking about defining these new trades. They must be defined. I couldn't agree more. They must be defined. And I said to him, yeah, but they've got to be farmer-led and they've got to be farmer-owned. What do you think of that? And he said, well, yeah, I wonder about the farmer-owned. But if we want to change the outcome, the investment has got to go into the land. It's got to go into the soil. If it doesn't, you will not change anything. So we've got to have a new economic model. A lot of talk now about the end of globalization, effectively. And in many cases, I think we live in the best of times and the worst of times. And it sort of goes back to that conversation around AI as to the morality of all of this. Are the good guys going to win, or is evil going to take over? As far as food goes, as far as our planet goes, we have to win, because otherwise nothing will change. And I just want to wrap up, really, with some conclusions. I've run in quite a few marathons. If I don't set a target for how I want to run that marathon and the time that I want to achieve it in, if I don't, when I go for a daily run, sadly look at my Strava and be competitive with myself, how would I ever get to the end in the time that I want to do it in? Setting targets is a good thing. Why are we so incapable of setting any targets for food? The UK has a maritime climate, phenomenal climate on which to produce food. Nobody has set a target for food. I battled for 6 solid years with Conservative prime ministers saying, don't you think we could have a target for food production? Don't you think 75 million people in the next decade on an island, don't you think we should know how much food we've got? Don't you think we should have a set of metrics that we can measure so that if we're slipping and it's stuff that we're good at, like dairy, like beef, like lamb, like growing fruit and vegetables, which is getting less and less and less, don't you think we should form that metric so we can monitor this? No. With the new legislation that was put in place, it was decided that actually we could monitor this every 5 years. Every 5 years? I mean, your self-sufficiency could have gone from 60% to 30% in 5 years without anybody realizing. And in the meantime, everybody was getting incredibly excited about signing up to the biodiversity targets. The G7 countries, all of them, very energized, very excited about signing up to the biodiversity targets. I'm excited about signing up to the biodiversity targets. What I'm saying is, if you do one without the other, you create a poor relation. And what I am saying to the UK government at the moment, that don't forget, enshrined in law, that all new developments must achieve biodiversity net gain. Net gain is the principle of achieving a 10% uplift in biodiversity. But it's binding. So if you are a developer and you have to achieve your BNG, you then have to have land that you cannot produce food on. You can plant trees on it, but you have to take it out of production so that you can achieve for biodiversity. Now that is completely bonkers. Now I take you back to Africa, to Embu County. They have an ambition to plant 15 billion trees in Kenya alone, 15 billion. But they want them to be food-producing trees. They want to deliver a multifaceted benefit, because they have to, of producing macadamia nuts, of producing mangoes, of producing avocados, of producing bananas, so that it can deliver a multifaceted return. Do we have that ambition? No, we don't. So the developed world should in many cases hang its head in shame for its lack of ambition on leadership, what I talked about at the very, very beginning. This has to be about leadership, and it has to be about representation. You can't lead if you don't take people with you. But we are at that pressing tipping point. So I start, and apologies for making such a point about food targets. I get told, well, isn't that a bit Stalin-esque, talking about food targets? No. How else are we going to feed this growing population? How else are we going to double that food production if we don't have a target? And, you know, there are things that my country is good at. There are also things that it's not going to be producing. It's not going to be producing citrus fruits. It's not going to be producing avocados that other countries are going to do well. And so trade is a good thing. Trade is what has transformed and can transform life in Africa. We need to have the key performance indicators to deliver this One Health approach. And we need to make sure that it hits the ground. And baselining data has to be a key part of what that looks like. Only 37% of our world is farmland, and that is getting smaller day by day. And you bring in all of these other targets, and it's getting a lot smaller day by day. And we are so reliant on the world's finite resources. Now, they are finite resources. They are what it says on the tin. They are finite. Agriculture, again, offers the solutions for not only how we feed people, but how we live our daily lives, how we build our buildings, how we produce biodegradable latex. I've been involved with a great project with one of our members that has developed a biorefinery. All their packaging is made out of that tomato plant. We can have so many of the solutions that are made by the crops that are grown in the soil. We need, I think, to work with the world as it is and not what we think it should be. So many good things are stopped because we see a world how it should be, and we have to accept it for how it is, and that's why we have to work at local first and national and global. We have to take people with us on this journey. The Borlaug point, precision breeding, new varieties to deal with the world that we're inhabiting now, that could not be more important. Putting nature on the balance sheet and not allowing it to become a commodity. When I talk to the government at home, I talk about food, nature, and biodiversity net gain. You've got to look at all of them in the round. The right nutrient in the right place. Again, in Africa, the black soldier fly can turn manure and food waste into an essential high-protein feed for fish. We're behind the curve. We know what insect protein can do, but I don't think we've even touched the sides on resource use efficiency as to how we can deliver on all of this and the other good that it can do. I think it's interesting, and I say this slightly nervously, I've watched the elections playing out across the world. We all had a huge interest in the US elections. I am, in awe is the wrong word, but I am staggered at the Trump agenda, and we have to listen to it. We really have to listen to it because he has created a meaning with the people. Now, many would say, well, the rhetoric and the policy are two different things. I think that's probably right. That was to a certain extent right with Boris Johnson, but he didn't have the right people around him to deliver on the policy. If we're going to take people with us, we have to get the messaging right, and we have been far too jargon-orientated. We've known what it means, just. You know, back in the day of Sir John Beddington and the Foresight Report, it was all about sustainable intensification. Nobody ever really understood what that was. Productivity has been misinterpreted over the years massively as, well, you just guys want to produce more, you couldn't care less about anything else. So the language, we have a lot to learn from people. They don't want the nuts and bolts. They don't want a PhD in agriculture. They just want to know how they're going to be fed and that we're doing the good stuff, but we've got to take them with us. And I guess what I'd finish by saying is that food can deliver so much for our health. We have a world now where the malnourished and the overweight are marching stride for stride, and that is truly bonkers. So if we are genuine about humanity, the people in this room have so much to give as to how we change that. And I would love to think that every child, everywhere in the world, has the opportunity to have access to green spaces, has the opportunity to grow food, be that in an allotment, or be that on a small subsistence farm in Kenya, or be that here in the UK, but they've got to have access to green spaces. They've got to have access to the ability to grow their own food, to create that closer relationship with the land that they inhabit. And if we can achieve that, then they will come on this journey. But where we are at the moment, the UK is responsible for the highest level of food waste in any European country. And that is because people have simply stopped valuing their food. And it has to change. And my time in the House of Lords will be spent very much trying to rebuild that link between our children and our planet, because I do believe they care, and I do believe all of us here have a role in helping them get that opportunity, and that can change lives. So thank you very, very much for listening. Thank you for having me.
Minette, thank you so much, and don't be running away. Because we're going to bring you back to join our panel now. Continuing in a similar vein to that which the Baroness Batters was discussing, but in the context of harnessing partnership to advance food security and One Health, would you please welcome our next panel. Leading and moderating the conversation is Professor Wayne Powell, who's Principal and Chief Executive of Scotland's Rural College, and he's going to be joined by panelists Dr. Peter Durhout, who's Vice President for Research at Iowa State University, Philip Phiri, who's Executive Director at the National Competitiveness Commission in Zimbabwe, Professor Ken Sloan, Vice Chancellor and Chief Executive Officer of Harper Adams University, Professor Ursula Laverty, MBE, Technical and R&D Director at Pilgrims Europe, the Right Honourable, the Baroness Minette Batters, and George Scutaru, who's Chief Executive Officer of the New Strategy Centre in Romania. Please welcome our panel.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Really enjoyed the conversations this morning and Minette's presentation. I'm going to turn to my panelists shortly and invite them to both introduce themselves and comment and give a perspective on Minette's presentation. What I'd like to do, though, is offer a couple of thoughts to initiate the conversation. And the first is, Minette, you raised or mentioned someone who was one of my science heroes, Norman Borlaug. And I had the pleasure of meeting Norman in CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Center in Mexico a number of years ago. And I think there was two things that were really important about that, which I think in some ways touches on the theme of this conference, and that is storytelling. The ability to tell a good story, but also optimism and hope. And that was something that shone through in the occasional conversations I was fortunate to have with Norman Borlaug. I want to make now 2 or 3 observations and comments. And the first one actually is something that has come through in many of the presentations, is diversity. When I talk about diversity, I'm not just talking about biological diversity, I'm also talking about differences in farming systems in terms of temperate and tropical agriculture, and many of our panelists today will be able to speak with great authority on some of those issues. The second theme, I think, is we are in a golden era of science and technology. However, the pace of adoption and diffusion of that technology is not fast enough. How do we accelerate that? What about the institutional innovations that we need to absorb, diffuse, and deploy technology? I guess the third theme is the importance of circularity. When we look at farming, we look at energy, and indeed, when we look at livestock, the importance of circularity, but also the challenge of zoonotic diseases. And finally, I just want to, I think at the last session, Chad mentioned a timeline of 2050. So for 2050, it's going to be interesting, because the projections are that the pressure on land use will decline. That is because population growth is slowing down. So demographics are changing the shape of our world and changing them fast. Population growth is slowing down for many reasons, but one of which is the number of women in full-time education. What is a world of 2050 going to look like from the point of view of agriculture, food, health, diet, energy? And if we are moving to a world of decarbonisation, where will we get our platform chemicals from? What will be our source of chemicals into the future? All of this means that agriculture is sitting right at the epicenter of both these challenges and opportunities. So with that, I think I'll work along. Please do introduce yourselves, and if you wish, say something that people won't know about you. Over to you, Peter.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Peter Dorhout. I'm the Vice President for Research at Iowa State University, and I'm a chemist by training. That might not necessarily be the thing that people don't know about me that I wanted to share. I do want to share, and that was a great introduction to the previous panel. Tell us something about yourselves that nobody would know. I'm a Boy Scout, I'm an Eagle Scout, and have spent most of my youth as well as my adult years being a volunteer leader, being an individual who helped young boys and young girls understand the value of trustworthiness. And trustworthiness, I think, is an important theme around building partnerships and identifying solutions and ultimately deploying those solutions out into the communities, because I think one of our challenges within academics in particular is building that sense of trust. I like how our previous speaker, in one of your slides, you talked about there's so much that they can teach us. I particularly gravitated towards that quote, because that is really what the Iowa State University and our university history has taught us, as having an office in all 99 counties in the state of Iowa, serving our farming communities and our producers. But having those offices has not just been about extending the university, but rather extending the cooperation and learning about the challenges, learning about what farmers and producers have run into, whether it's a new pest, whether it's an interest in a particular varietal, whether it's my cows are not producing milk, what is the challenge? And learning from our communities and bringing that back into our university. And as America's first land-grant university, Iowa State University takes pride in that relationship and partnership building, because partnerships are really important.
Thank you so much. My name is Philip Puri. Being in a panel, it's very clear that I'm coming from Africa with all these other colleagues sitting with me here. One thing that maybe those that might know me don't know about me is that my early stages in my life, I was into science, physics and biology, and I actually pivoted at when I became an adult and went into research and business administration. But after the presentation this morning about galaxies, I'm realizing how much I'm missing if I had continued doing physics and sciences. But just to say about the research work that we do, especially on the food and health issues, we have realized that the global village is dying slowly because the discovery of so much food, processed foods, that is killing people, is so alarming. And as such, as a nation, Zimbabwe, we are focusing mostly on producing superfoods to export to the global village. And we've had so many success stories around that. At the same time, we do have problems with climate change that has affected even our own staple food production, leaving a lot of our people in Africa with a lot of challenges in terms of getting nutrition and even getting the basic staple foods. But it's something that we are happy that the leadership in Africa is looking at that, starting off with what we call the Abuja Declaration, which looks at how can we improve productivity of crops. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. I'm Ken Sloan. I'm the Vice Chancellor and Chief Executive of Harper Adams University in the UK. What can I share that you may not know about me? I think some of my friends, given that I am the Vice Chancellor of a Science and Technology University, would be horrified to know that I was kicked out of biology at the age of 13 on the grounds that I always came up with too artistic a reply to most of the work that was done. But I think the bigger thing was my grandmother always used to talk to me about the one skill that you need to have as a young person going through life is the ability to grapple with surprise, uncertainty, and ambiguity and know what to do about it. And I was tested quite quickly on that when I left home to go to university, because by the time I got back at the end of my first semester, my family had moved. And they moved house, moved town, and apparently they told me that they had told me this, but I had no understanding of that. So I very, very quickly had to work out how do you discover where your family has moved to when in a time when you didn't have mobile phones and geo-tracking and various other things. So that whole issue about skills of ambiguity was really important. If I think about the topic we're talking about, I find myself in a very confused state because I'm working with two very particular communities amongst all the other things that I'm doing at the moment. And they have food in the middle of them, and they have health in the middle of them, but their situations could not be more different. So in Telford, which is our local town, we're dealing with the fact, and we're working with the local health authorities, because we're a food-focused university, to explore how we can use health as a preventative tool within the health system locally, and how we can use access to good nutrition to unlock the potential of young people who may be underachieving in school. So mainly because an awful lot of the health conditions that people are facing are food and food related. And then if I jump to another country I'm working with, which is the Teso region of Uganda, we have the complete opposite going on, which is they are suffering health consequences because of lack of access to food, lack of access to nutrition, lack of access to just the fire in their belly each morning to make sure that they've got the opportunity to thrive and deliver. So when I think about the global aspect of the food system, it seems somewhat odd and somewhat perverse to me that in pockets of the world we are overproducing to such an extent and wasting to such an extent, And in plain sight, we are seeing still starvation, malnutrition, and yet we don't seem to have the political or the practical will to put that whole system back together and ask the fundamental question, which is how do we sort that out? So I don't think that we can genuinely say that we're really committed to the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals unless we get this food as a basic entitlement, nutrition as a basic entitlement right, because I don't know how we achieve any of the others if we don't get that one right.
Thanks, Ken. So I'm Ursula Lavery, and I look after technical and scientific research and development at Pilgrims Europe. And for those of you who don't know, Pilgrims Europe is a food manufacturing business. We have our agriculture, we have our slaughter facilities, and we have manufacturing operations. So part of our business is vertically integrated. So we have agriculture from beginning to end within our poultry operation. So when I talk about One Health, when we talk about food resilience, when we talk about food security, we absolutely feel all of that need and all of that want in terms of having One Health across our society. Something that some of you may not know about me, some of you will do, is that Minette talked about Farm Africa. I was very privileged a few years ago to join a group of ladies from the food industry who went out to support the community in Tanzania, and that was called a big beehive build. So we went out and we built 142 beehives for a very small community in Tanzania. And I think one of the earlier speakers, Manny, was talking about electricity and how do we support developing countries. We went out to see a small village. We travelled 2 hours in a bus, and then the bus could travel no further. So we then walked for 45 minutes along a dirt track, and we came to a community, a small village, and they had no access to running water, they had no access to electricity, and of course they were burning fossil fuels. But that tells us that we have a very divided society. So we have to ensure that whatever we're doing, we are remembering that there are people who do not have the luxuries that we have. And until you actually go there, until you actually talk to people, until you actually see the conditions they're living in, you cannot appreciate the sort of conditions people have. So I think we sit in a very privileged society. We talk about what our needs are, and we talk about what we must do, and we're absolutely right, we must do that. But we also must remember that there are huge parts of the globe who cannot do this without our help. So I think from my point of view, One Health and food resilience is not something that's a local, national challenge, it's an international challenge. And I think I certainly am very passionate. I'm passionate about 3 key things in my world: animal welfare, food safety, and then the overall One Health and food resilience. I'm going to stop there and pass over to Minette.
Hello, my name is George Scutaro. I'm coming from Romania, a Black Sea country, and Black Sea is a battlefield. Because I want to introduce another dimension of security and food security, the link between these 2 topics. You know, yesterday, Russia has bombed again Ukrainians' export infrastructure of grain in Odessa ports, in Danube also ports. 400 million people in Africa and Asia dependent on grain coming from Ukraine. 20% of all United Nations humanitarian program for Africa have grain from Ukraine. This is a part of reality. Russia is trying to transform food in a weapon. And this weaponization of food is part of Russian hybrid warfare. And you can see this internalization of evil, because Danube ports are bombed by Russia with Iranian drones. And Ukrainian ports from the Black Sea are bombed with North Korean missiles. And they are working pretty well together. What is necessary to do? And I give an example. Romania bought 2 minesweepers. Okay, it's something different from agriculture, but from the United Kingdom. And by the way, Royal Navy has a very good cooperation with the Romanian Navy. Why? To secure export of Ukraine of grain to the global markets. Most of you know the importance of Egypt, but social stability in Egypt depends on grain coming from the Black Sea area. 30% of grain for Egypt is coming from Russia, 20 from Romania, 10 from Ukraine. And by the way, they had 3 or 4 PITA revolutions triggered by problems with grain on internal market. The stability of the wider Black Sea region, it's important for global market. It's necessary to understand that the weaponization of food is part of Russian hybrid warfare, like weaponization of energy or weaponization of migration. Because they want also to affect Ukrainian economy. Each dollar which is coming from Ukrainian export of grain, and by the way, this is the most important product for Ukrainian export, it's flowing to the war effort to resist against Russian attack. We started in Romania in March 2022, few weeks after the beginning of invasion in Ukraine, with a transit of 300,000 tons of cereals to our territory. In 2023, 70% of entire Ukrainian export to the global market of grain has flowed to Romania. We put on the table 400 million euro, not money from EU or from the United States, just to enhance our logistic capacity, to help Ukraine to resist and to continue to export to the global market, and to not disrupt the global flow of cereals to Africa or to Asia. And this is a part of reality. Each day, please have in mind, Black Sea is a battle. For this reason, it's necessary, for instance, to maintain together freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, an open and free Black Sea, because to maintain stability in a country in Africa or the Middle East.
Thank you. I sometimes introduce myself as a retired PE teacher. I started life as a PE teacher many decades ago, and I guess it's one of the messages from the last session was what drives people, what motivates people, what are your passion. And I think for me, I think working with young people, with students, is so important and something that I kind of get a great feeling about. What I want to do now is maybe pose a specific question to the panel, and that is, if we look at the demographics, global population, by 2050, approximately 10 billion, plus or minus, and whatever a standard error one applies, 5 billion will be in Asia, 4 billion will be in Africa, and Africa will have the youngest population in the world. What do we need to do? What can we do? What should we be doing in terms of partnerships with that agenda, particularly from the perspective of Africa?
Maybe I can start. Very good statistic there. I think statistics show that 70% of the population in Africa is below the age of 30, meaning that it's a future potential market for any economy globally to collaborate with Africa in terms of the skills development. But if you look at again at the statistic, 60% of arable land in the whole world is in Africa. That is a very fertile ground for any nation to want to collaborate with Africa. With the geopolitical conflict you mentioned, I'll speak specifically from what Zimbabwe did as a strategy. When we were hit with the grain or the wheat that we normally used to import from Ukraine and Russia, the government deliberately went on a recovery plan, which they then engaged certain private sector, the banks, to go on to what you call a presidential input scheme. This resulted in us in 2023 being self-sufficient for the first time in terms of wheat production, with an excess of about 30% of wheat produced in Zimbabwe earmarked for exports into the region. So this has motivated us as a nation to say, perhaps this food situation that they're facing in Uganda, we can fix it by ourselves if we mobilize resources towards certain areas in our lives that are actually affecting the general population, which is the poor in the rural areas. We have embarked in the past 2 years on a climate-proof strategy that was used by our ancestors before, which they call Fumbudza. It's like you dig holes before the rainy season comes and you start planting your maize or your cereals. When the rain comes and it is trapped in those holes, it is able now to assist the crops to actually germinate and also actually live to harvest time. We have seen the production of maize, which is our staple food, increasing through Fumbudza. And we managed to have, for the first time in about 10 years, we managed to have a strategic grain reserve that was set at, I think, about 500,000 metric tons being held by our grain marketing agency in Zimbabwe. It has assisted in alleviating the drought that we faced previous year, farming season, the El Nino drought. We had to import, of course, to supplement what was coming in, also to ask for aid, but it really helped in terms of coming up with strategies. But the best thing that for any nation that wants to collaborate, especially in terms of food production with Africa, there is arable land and the workforce, the labor is there. It is quite young, quite vigilant and efficient, and the labor costs at the current moment in Africa are very low in terms of how you can. So those are ingredients that are required for anybody who wants to collaborate to produce food. We need to start looking at international or global value chains. A country that has the resources, which is financial resources, but there's no arable land, should partner in an African country to begin to produce food for themselves and also for Africa, so that at least the global value chains can become more meaningful as we go into the future, which is very uncertain in terms of food production. The other thing that can also be a plus is that if you look at the African farming ecosystem, we have been low in terms of the usage of fertilizers and other additives to food. That is the reason why the Abuja Declaration agreed that they need to increase the usage of fertilizer for food security. Currently in Africa, a hectare of land produces about 1.4 to about 4.5 metric tons of crop. But if you look at developed countries like Brazil, India, Ukraine, the production of crop is about 2.5 times more than what Africa can do, because they use more fertilizers, they use more technology. It's an opportunity for countries that are advanced in technology to partner with Africa so that we can all globally sustain food security within this country. And the last thing, if you look at the soils in Africa, some of them are able to produce what you call organic food. Closer to home, we recently certified last year pineapples going into Europe, Denmark, Ireland. We what we call Victorian pineapples, and they were certified organic by international organizations because the area where they are being grown, fertilizer and other chemicals have never been used. We've got macadamia nuts going into China now, lots of them. We've got the Hass avocados. Recently, the blueberries that are actually going into the Tesco's and all over in Netherlands. It's an opportunity to partner, to collaborate with African countries, especially if we come to organic food and deal with the health issues that are coming up with some of these chemicals that are put in our agriculture. Thank you.
Ken.
I would say that we've got to make a shift from seeing partnership based on aid to one which is about co-success. I still think that there's too much of a perspective that there's a country that knows how to do certain things that is going to another country to help them to do what they do. I was taken by what Manette said in her speech before, which is that it's only when you get into other countries and see what they do and how they do it, you realize that there is absolute mutual benefit on sharing these populations. So we run a program with a charity which is based in the east of England, which identifies and targets influential people who are working within land and farming. And they come to the UK and they do 10 weeks of intensive work with us, and then they can go back and train the trainers, so you end up with a multiplier. But we also need to reverse that out. We need people from the UK to go to Africa, but not with the intention of just simply doing something which is transferring in one direction, but actually learning from the different ways and different approaches that have been taken. I think from my perspective, though, the real benefit of working in a much more co-success strategic way with the continent of Africa is because of that age profile. Because you have the ability to work with a sustained population over a much longer period of their lives to embed something and make sure that the overall productivity of the country and the countries and the continent do actually deliver what they're able and have the potential to do. And if they do manage to do that, then all of us will win.
Like many universities around the world, we have a campus that's outside of our state, and Iowa, it turns out, it's the current home of the World Food Prize, and Iowa State hosts the Borlaug Lecture Series that we just finished up last week. And I had an opportunity to meet with a number of students that actually gather together during the Borlaug series of lectures that are coming from all over the world, including our campus in Uganda. And again, one of the keys to the success of that relationship, or those relationships, is about this two-way partnership. That we have individuals students, faculty, staff members, who are in Uganda and are there around the clock, learning from the communities and the needs of those communities within Uganda, studying the challenges with infectious disease, with antimicrobial resistance, and as the National Center for Antimicrobial Resistance and Education, Iowa State does step up to partner with those folks to really understand under those conditions, what are you seeing? What are you learning from the challenges that you're having? And how can we work together, both in Uganda and back in Iowa, to really understand and appreciate and address the challenges together?
And I think following on from that, within the UK, although we are a developed nation, we still face a lot of problems which are actually not dissimilar to the problems you're facing. And even though we would appear on the outset to be developed, where we would fall down is that we actually, in some cases, don't have the ambition. In some cases, we're very risk averse to moving into new technologies. And on other occasions, we're just not joined up. So there is certainly, I can certainly see learnings that we need to be taking from you, because you are ambitious, you want to work together, you want to embrace new technologies. And if we think about gene editing, for example, within the UK, we're very risk averse, but yet we know that that could have great potential for the future. We know that we need regulation, etc., around that. But part of what we need to be looking at in the future is how do we help each other? So there are answers that can work within the UK, and there are things which we should be exporting to other more developing countries. So I think, going forward, we talked about, in several of the previous speeches and talks and presentations, talked about how do we have a better means of delivering for developing countries, which means that they are not paying for this, they're actually sharing their knowledge with us, and it becomes like a symbiotic relationship where we're working together. So I think that's quite key as well.
Thank you. Minette, would you like to come in?
I completely agree with everything that's been said, but I guess what I want to add to this, what I was really struck by when I was out in Africa was my twin children who are both at university. They took the decision, it might change, but they don't want a farm. One is doing finance and accounting, and one is doing a nursing degree. When I was out in Kenya, the mums that I spoke to were so proud that their children had left the smallholding and gone to Nairobi. And they said they want the big jobs. I mean, it was just sort of home from home. So their children, and who doesn't want a better education, right, for their kids? But what I said to you about the growing of cat in Kenya, if those people don't come back and farm and they want the big jobs, what then? And you know, the average age of a farmer in the UK is in their late 50s. And if things don't change, who is going to be the farmer, effectively, of the future? And that's a challenge for Africa as much as it's a challenge for the UK and the rest of the Europe and the whole of the world's food producers. Because what I said about I've met farmers all across the world, I have, and all of those farming families, they would all say the same thing. They want the big job and they want a better education. And that's a real looming problem that no one has the answer to yet.
Okay, my job as expert on security is to put light on vulnerabilities. And we know how important it is to help Africa. We spent in the last 3 years more than $100 billion to contain Russia. Could you imagine if you spent 10 billion to help Africa, or 50 billion? But in the same time, in June, at EU level, we almost double our import of fertilizers from Russian Federation. We think that we are more independent in terms of security energy from Russia, because Russia is using gas like a hammer to put pressure, but we change our interdependence, moving this dependence on fertilizers, and practically we put our food security in Putin's hands. It's some ambivalent behavior of us, okay? With left hand, we are paying Ukraine to resist, and with right hand, we are paying Putin for LNG or fertilizer, but in fact, feeding Russian war machine, and not use this money to stop the war in Ukraine, to achieve a victory, and after to help better and more Africa.
Thank you. Just probably to respond to the observation about the young in Africa not wanting to go into farming, I think that narrative is changing. I'll speak from the experience I've seen in Botswana, South Africa, Zambia, Malawi. There's a lot of interest coming up from the youths taking up land and farming. The reason being is because the education system that was set by the colonizers made us want to do the white-collar jobs and be in big factories. But the previous generations have gone to school and acquired the qualifications but couldn't get the jobs. So they've realized that now the only source of wealth is the land. Most of them, the young people coming from universities, are actually going to the ministries of lands and applying for land. We have got so many young farmers now in Zimbabwe, even as young as 20 years old. And some of the success stories, if you would follow Zimbabwe's horticulture sector, which is quite booming at the moment now, you would discover some of the success stories are very young people in Zimbabwe. One success story who even got an award internationally is a gentleman called Terry. He's into poultry farming and all that. He has actually been attracted international reviews on that. And you have got people like Leslie Marange, I'm quite sure it's a Glytime thing. He's actually even doing what you call contract farming with various small households in Zimbabwe. And he's only 25 years old. We're talking a lot of number. We could go on the whole day. But there's a changing that is taking place in Africa right now, which if followed in the next 20 or 30 years, we are going to see a lot of young Africans going into farming. It is because, number one, there are no jobs in Africa for the technically skilled or even the white-collar jobs. So everyone is now defaulting back to the traditional subsistence farming, at the same time having an appetite for commercial farming.
Thank you. So I'll make one comment before we start wrapping things up. From my own institution's perspective, we have two fairly significant Gates grants working with countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think there's one point about this is that it gives you a great opportunity to deliver research at scale and with impact. So the impact of what you can do is phenomenal, and that changes the culture of the organization and changes the dynamic of the organization in such a positive way. So I think we need to harness all of our resources, and Minette, as you were touching on, really ensuring that we support international development through our GDP contributions. I think these are really, really important issues. Maybe to conclude, if I can ask each panel member just to make one point about what lessons have we learned regarding food security over the past 6 or 7 years, and particularly as we probably may be entering a period of deglobalization. What are the things we've learned, and what do we do about it? Just very quickly, we've got less than 2 minutes.
I would say that the intersection of food and animals and humans, and that One Health concept that Minette discussed with this group earlier, is such an important consideration, especially when we think about how food security is global security and civil security.
I'll say that the biggest threat to food security is global warming. And we need to start thinking very deeply about how we create global value chains. Those with the capital must look at those with the resources.
I think we've learned that if we don't take a joined-up approach to the food security system by looking globally, then similar to what happened with vaccines in the first instance with the pandemic, there will just be a war based on who gets there first. And we see that in the food system. We see that there are winners and losers, and we can do significantly better than that.
I think we've learned that we have an increasingly complex, fragile supply chain within the food industry. And I don't think we actually understand how fragile that is across the globe. And I think that's the point that we have to tackle, and tackle very quickly, so that we don't end up with another catastrophe as far as food's concerned.
And I think plan in peacetime we didn't do, and we never have done. If you look back, we have reacted to massive challenges, and we've reacted and we've come through. And most recently, COVID would be a real case in point. I know the UK government at one stage, we were very out of favour, probably still are with many European countries at the time, but they thought we were going to run out of food. And it was for 2 days. But I had messages from government ministers who were saying, you can have whatever you want. You can have as much money, as many people, you can have anything, but we cannot run out of food. And then, of course, they realized that supply chains were going to function. But to Ursula's point, they are fragile. And there really needs, I think, to be a coming together of not continuing to take food for granted. We have a huge global challenge to feed the world. But I am determined to keep it as an exciting time, because I think it is an exciting time of what we can achieve. And I'm delighted to hear what you say about Africa and how things are changing and young people coming in. But that is the future. So we have got to make this One Health vision an exciting vision for young people to really want to engage with, because therein lies the solution. So that has to be the focus rather than reacting to the massive events that we have done, we've got through, but we won't continue to get through it. If we keep on doing what we always did, we'll always get what we always got, and it won't stand up for the long term.
We're in the middle of a poly crisis, and especially we are in the middle of challenges coming from authoritarian states. And indeed, you can make America great again, or UK great again, or Europe great again, but first of all, you should cooperate, trying to have a better world and trying to hold the line, especially, as I mentioned, to countering these all authoritarian evil states approaching us.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Please join me in thanking our panellists.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much indeed for that excellent panel discussion. And ladies and gentlemen in the hall, it's now time for a bit of exercise and for a bit of a transition. Time to move to the workshops over in the Peter Froggatt Centre. So could I invite Dr. Paul Madden, who's Director of the Centre for Competitiveness in Northern Ireland, up to the stage to introduce the workshops and tell you how to get there. Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. My task at the moment is to introduce you to the workshops, which is a new concept for the Global Innovation Summit. We listened to feedback from delegates at previous events like this, and your request was very much to be given an opportunity to engage more proactively with panelists and to have a more open sort of discussion type session. So what we've done this afternoon is we've organized a series of workshops. When you registered for the conference, you will have been presented with a list of the 5 options that you have this afternoon. If you've already registered for one, that's fine. If you haven't, or if you change your mind about which particular workshop you would like to attend, that's also fine. And in the interest of time, because we're running behind schedule slightly, I have been asked to do a reverse Brian Cox and actually speed up time rather than slow it down. So I will skip through some of these slides very quickly. This is the list of workshops that you would have been presented with when you registered. And you can see there they broadly fit in line with the theme of today's conference and earlier discussions. Seizing the decarbonisation opportunity, transforming the world via innovation and energy, food security, which is just the discussion we've had just a few moments ago, advancing resources productivity, and finally, accelerating sustainability and inclusiveness through R&D. Now, each of these workshops will follow the same format. They're scheduled to run for 75 minutes, but we may try to shorten them. Each workshop has a designated moderator whose task will be to introduce the subject of the workshop and try to draw a theme for that workshop with the discussions that have taken place so far today. Depending on which workshop you go to, there may be 4, 5, or 6 discussants or panelists, each of whom will be given an opportunity between 5 and 7 minutes to talk to the subject theme of the workshop from their own knowledge and from their own experience. And then the moderator will open up the workshop to the delegates, to the floor, for questions and answers. And that's where we need your help. That's where we're offering you the opportunity to actively engage, follow up what the participants and the panelists have said, give your own perspective or views on the subject area. And the final part of the workshop will be down to the moderator to summarize the conversation that has taken place and to try to distill from that conversation 2 or 3 key issues or challenges or recommendations that they will then bring back to this hall for the final panel session, because the final panel session for today is an opportunity for all 5 workshops to feed back to the general audience what has been discussed at each workshop. So we need you to do 2 things particularly. actively participate in the workshop, firstly. And when you leave here and go to the workshops, there will be university staff outside to guide you, but very simply, you go out through the door you came in, turn right, walk about 100 metres, turn left, go through an archway, past the marquee where you had lunch, and the large red brick glass-fronted building is where the workshops are actually being hosted. The second thing we need you to do is to be back here on time. If not, you will be spaghettified, to quote Brian Cox. So I shall leave it at that, and I hope you enjoy the workshops, and we'll see you back here later. Thank you.